Hello, everybody. Okay, my microphone seems to be jumping, which is good. See if I can do this with the split screen. Okay, so updates on the quizzes. There's a lot of desperate TAs trying to finish. I got a note at midnight from one TA saying I have to get some sleep. I'll be at this first thing Sunday morning, which is it's Sunday evening, and have it by the end of today. I haven't checked yet, so I'll keep working. But we seem to be close. Uh, as you know, everything is 10 times harder these days, whether it's popping out for a Mars bar or trying to buy a house. So that's the update on our on the midterm. Tonight I'm going to take on full on the Wasteland, probably one of the most difficult poems to understand in English or possibly any language, which is good for me because if everything was self-evident, I wouldn't have a job, right? So just don't think about yourself all the time. There need to be obscure, difficult poems so that someone will pay me to explain them, right? Yeah. So you wouldn't want to, you wouldn't want to go down to the GO station and see me standing there with a Tim Hortons cup saying, give me a quarter and I'll give you a lecture on the Wasteland. Although, honestly, my lecture on the Wasteland, if I would deliver it at the top of my voice at the GO station, wouldn't surprise anybody. Nobody would stop and listen. They'd just say, this poor guy, he's nuts. And they'd give me a loony and they'd get on the train. You guys know better, I think. But, I'm not actually crazy. But one of the themes of the poem, in fact, is to quote a line from Emily Dickinson, that much madness is divinest sense. And the truth is, the divine, the sacred, the transcendental certitude we've been talking about for so long, that those things don't actually make sense. That isn't the point. So what the age of science kind of pushed out the age of faith, not in a malicious way, but the age of faith doesn't make sense. I mean, that's what faith is. It's believing in something without proof, which doesn't make sense. And belief and doubt are the same thing. When you believe, you've overcome your doubt. When you doubt, you seek to restore your faith and your belief. You cannot have faith in something you can prove because there's no need for faith. If I say 2 + 2 = 4, have faith, you don't have to have faith, it's 4. If I say 2 + 2 = 5, have faith, you're going to say, what does faith have to do with it? You can't add. So we've gotten so used to this Googleization of the world where everything has an answer. And everything makes sense. That we probably notice, World War I didn't make sense. It was fought with technology. It was fought with machinery. It was fought with tons of money that had come from far-flung empires. Lots of logic went into that. Lots of science, lots of machines, lots of calculations, and it erupted into a madness. It killed 20 million people, 20 million, most young men. It didn't even just kill a million people who were elderly. It killed them in the prime of their lives. And they would have lived full lives, most of them, had they not died in the trenches and in the mud of World War I. So World War I was insanity. It was an insanity fought according to logic. So that was the other myth that kind of got shattered, which is that that instrumental rationality had replaced faith and better than faith because you could prove it and it got things done. But we need more than instrumental rationality. We have to believe in something. What you believe in can vary, but it's hard to imagine why we get up in the morning if we literally didn't believe in anything. But that's also another theme in this poem, because this poem dramatically, especially if you think back to Dover Beach, makes a sharp turn from the age of anxiety into the age of depression. So anxiety, you can see in Dover Beach, love, let us be true to word, because nothing out there is making any sense, and where ignorant armies crash by night, Matthew Arnold's very anxious. So anxiety is when you know you've lost something, you know you're lost, you know you're off base, and you're super anxious to get back. Uh, that's very different than depression, because depression is feeling lost, feeling like you are lost, and giving up hope, finding yourself unable to hope or believe that you'll ever get back to where you were, that either that place is gone, or you're sealed off from you, or as I said earlier, it's shattered. It's a shattered vase. It's shattered into a million pieces. Uh, so when you feel you've lost something, you can go from anxiety, which is desperately trying to get back. But this is a poem. This poem is very different because it's fighting depression, which is in a way more serious. I mean, obviously severe anxiety is an issue, but mild anxiety is we need. I mean, being a little anxious that the midterm is coming up means you might study, or anxious that you hurt someone's feelings, you might apologize. I mean, we need anxiety. We have too much of it, and we have anxiety about we don't know why we're anxious, and so that's a very uncomfortable feeling, and there's a lot of that in the age of anxiety. But depression is more, in some ways, is more alarming, because it's like you go from being anxious and trying to figure out what's wrong to giving up. And of course, you can come back from depression and you can calm yourself down from anxiety, but it's a little hard to come back from depression. People can say calm down when you're anxious, and that helps a little. But telling a depressed person to cheer up is, well, it's insensitive and pointless. Do you think they wouldn't cheer up if they could? Something has gone wrong. A gear has slipped. They've forgotten how to hope. You have to help them hope again. And this is what trauma would do, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is it's a sort of circumstantial depression, where you were in a situation where you thought you were going to die. There's no reason that you're not dead, except that you're not. There's no reason that your friend should be dead, except that he is. Nothing made sense. No matter how brave you were or weren't, it didn't matter. That sets up, and you were trapped in that trench all night long while missiles whistled over your head, and any one of them could just take you out. And it was almost as bad not being taken out as it would be to be taken out. And that helpless feeling, the difference between trauma and having memories of being very, very frightened is, were you helpless, and was the frightening thing revisited on you over and over? I mean, it's one thing to walk by somewhere and there's a super loud noise and you jump a foot and you tell people, like, oh my God, I was scared to death. But then imagine that happening every few minutes for 4 years. At a certain point, you have to give up. And when you get back home, the reason they call it post-traumatic stress is that giving up is actually a survival strategy. You decide that you're dead. It's like, okay, I'm never getting out of here, so just stop worrying about it. I died here, so now let's get this machine gun up here and see what we can do before I'm dead. It's a survival. It's adaptive. It allows you to keep fighting, like to say that, well, I'm done. And then when suddenly it's over and you're not dead, you'd think it'd be like, oh yay, but by then you've committed to that adaptive strategy so much that it's a little like Marlowe when he gets back from the Congo. Nothing makes sense. He just wants to walk up to people and stare at them and say, do you know about the Congo? Do you understand how the world really works? Do you know how many natives are dying every day so you can play with your ivory piano keys? You know what's on the other end of the world, the other end of this string, the colony that makes the European wealth so possible. So this is so depression is that loss of the ability to hope, which is very closely linked to the inability to regenerate. So if you think about it, if faith and doubt are the same thing, it just depends on where you are on the spectrum. You can be doubting and trying to return to faith, and be believing, and for the moment at least not bothered by doubt. Now think about the difference between a meadow and a wasteland. Obviously, this poem is called The Wasteland. But in the same way, there's no difference between faith and doubt. There's no difference between a meadow and a wasteland. They're the same thing. The only difference is balance. So you balance your faith and your doubt. And usually it is a balancing act. It's rare that you have no doubt, and it's rare that you have no faith. But having no faith and only doubt pushes you into the realm of depression. Uh, and having absolute faith and no doubt may be too simplistic. I mean, fascism encouraged people just have faith in these powerful leaders. You don't have to know things are going to work out. Just give me all your power, and I'll make sure they work out for you. And of course, a loving parent will do that for a child, like a 3-year-old. Like, we're going to go for a walk and we're going to cross the street, and don't worry about it. I know how to cross the street, and you'll be safe. And that is a relationship that can be functional. But of course, parents and teachers, for that matter, are looking for opportunities to give power back to the child. So when the child's 10, 8, you might stand on the, well, I guess earlier than that, maybe 7, you might stand on the corner of a very not busy street and say, now what are you going to do? And then they look both ways, and they're like, do you see any cars that way? No. Do you see any cars this way? No. You think it's safe to cross? I think you're right. Go ahead. It takes you 20 minutes. Talk the kid across the street. But what you're really doing as a good parent and a good teacher, something that Lord Henry and Basil never did for Dorian Gray, is you see yourself as a guardian of their power. The 3-year-old child that is his or her own person. But you don't prove that by sending a 3-year-old out into traffic. Not having them wear a mask in a crowded, if you somehow have to walk through a supermarket. You don't ask the 3-year-old, do you feel like putting a piece of cloth across your face? No, not really. Okay. And it's up to you. That's stupid. That's bad parenting, bad governing. But the point of being a good teacher, I think, or being a good parent, is you see yourself as a guardian of the power that you are for the time being, holding in reserve for someone who needs your guidance. I mean, even with the Wasteland, right now, I'm inviting you to give me, quote unquote, all your power to read this while you listen to this lecture, because you're saying, what the heck is this poem about? But I don't want to leave you with a sense that you'll never understand this poem unless you listen to me. What I want to do is explain the poem in a way that, yeah, listening to me explains it, but I want to give you back your power at the end of the lecture or the end of the class and say, now you know how to cross the street. Now you know how to read this poem. And this, of course, you can't, there's no static meaning in this poem any more than there was in Dubliners. It's more about the states of humanity that are generated by the poem. And one of the biggest problems in World War I, I think World War I definitively pushed the needle from anxiety over to depression, because when we lost transcendental certitude, we got quite anxious. And then we put our faith in science, and we calmed down, because science was now as good as religion had ever been, and it seemed in many ways better. And then World War I blew up the world, blew up everything. And then we were terrified, and it had been so long since we relied on a transcendental certitude, and now science just blew up in our face. People just went into depression. And also, 20 million people died. The amount of grief, you need faith to grieve. If something terrible happens to you and you don't have faith in anything, you're going to slip from grieving to being depressed, because depression's numbness. April is the cruelest month. Forgetful snow had covered our roots, as Eliot said in the opening of this. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers, which is virtually a description of depression, feeding a little life with dried tubers. People who are depressed are not blooming, and they're not thriving, and they're not regenerating. And they can literally you can have low appetite. People say, do you want to go out and have a beer or a cup of coffee? And you is desperate and very much needs to do that. And you just like say, nah, I just feel lousy. And so you can't even get interested in things you need. And that's where depression can be a really difficult downward spiral, because the very things you need to keep you from being depressed, you're too depressed to pursue. And even the things that used to cheer you up don't. As Hamlet says, all things seem dry and profitless that once delighted. And that's the other thing that's so bizarre about depression. Say you loved walking on beaches. You lived to see a sunset on a beach. Now you're depressed. Well, then, isn't it an obvious thing? You should go to a beach and watch a sunset. And even if you can get yourself to do it, for some reason it doesn't work. And the reason is that it wasn't the sunset, and it wasn't that did anything for you. It's that something about the beauty of the sunset corresponded to the beauty of your faith. And so and I don't necessarily mean religious, although that's certainly one of them. But when you've lost your faith in life or yourself or someone you loved, or they've lost their faith in you, it's caused you to lose your faith in yourself. The sunset doesn't do anything. It's just some light. Who cares? When you're feeling that light matters and that you matter and that people matter to you and those same people think you matter and so on, the sunset's beautiful because the sunset simply affirms. It doesn't generate faith. It affirms it. And so if the faith is in the sunset, can't do anything. And in the whole wasteland, there's no water. It's not raining. This is an incredibly botanical poem. And it's even done according to seasons. So we start in the fall, we'll go through the fall, the leaves will fall, we'll have winter, and then it heads in spring at the very, very end of the poem. So it goes through the 4 seasons, and it goes through the elements. Book 1 is a lot about earth, roots, mountains, rocks, and then we'll move to water and spirit and air. So those 4 basic elements will be touched on in not there's some overlap, but burial of the dead is obviously more about earth, because you buried the dead in earth. And part of the problem is first of all, as I already told you, many soldiers were buried in the mud and not in a grave. So the burial of the dead was desecrated by World War I. There was no ceremony. There was no ritual. People just died in the field and got plowed over. So that's one way to cope with that lack of remembrance and that lack of ritual is to hide in forgetful snow and to barely not eat any more than you need to stay alive, not drink any more than you need to stay alive, and not do anything more than you need to stay alive. Everything is just barely enough to get to the next day. So then we had the summer surprised us coming over the Stambergese with a shower of rain. Now this is a memory, so it can rain in your memory. And just to continue this metaphor of the meadow and the wasteland, which think about this in the back of your mind my entire lecture, because a meadow, if there isn't rain, the grass dies. If the grass dies, the crickets and the grasshoppers die. If the crickets and grasshoppers die, the birds leave. The squirrels leave. Everybody leaves, and pretty soon the meadow will be a wasteland. Now, wasteland is implicit in the meadow. Things are dying in the meadow. It's just that things are getting reborn at least the same rate. So a death in a thriving meadow is very present, but it doesn't dominate because things are also coming alive. The problem, what happens with a wasteland is if you deny death, if you decide you're going to have a perfect meadow, you can doom the meadow to death. The wasteland, and this is in the first, when you think about it, going back to Dorian Gray, there is something death-phobic about Lord Henry, but it's not so obvious in Dorian Gray because it just seems to be youth. He keeps saying, without your youth, nobody cares, blah, blah, blah. You don't want to get old. And then he's like, no, I don't. I need to get old. But this is about death, because why do we care? What does it make? If we didn't die, if we were immortal, we wouldn't care. What would it even mean to say no one would get old? Although the epitaph from Sybil, which is at the front of this poem, is Sybil was a woman who asked for immortality but forgot to ask to stay young. It's almost a Dorian Gray should have read this. So she's thousands of years old, but she's dust. And remember that earlier we talked about that, come in under the shadow of the red rock, and I will show you something. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And from dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. So Sybil is just dust now. You'd think because she forgot to ask to stay youthful. And so she's in a jar, a shelf, and every now and then she gets taken down and passed around as a novelty. And when people ask her what she wants, she says, "I want to die." And there's a moment in Dante's Inferno, which is also something Eliot did very well, where there's in one of the circles of hell, people are extremely depressed, and Dante's being led around. He's being given a tour of hell by Virgil, not something you'd put on a travel brochure, but he's in this particular circle where everyone just looks really depressed and really unhappy, and Dante says, "Well, what did they do, or why they look like that?" And Virgil says, "They've just learned that they are never going to die, so they're in hell and they're walking around." That's bad enough, but bizarrely enough, the news that depresses them is that this is it for eternity. You don't die, and that's depressing. Okay, so that's weird. It sounds weird, but actually this poem is very much, and we saw this in The Dead, Joyce's The Dead, is that the tragedy is not to die, because we all do. The tragedy is to not live before you die. And one of the ways to not live before you die is to fear death so much that you don't live. You have to take a chance. You're going to get old, whether you put on the wrinkle creams. And I mean, I'm not saying don't take care of your health, by all means, but aging is aging. I mean, no, people don't get past 100 as a rule, and certainly not 110, no matter how fit they are or how many wrinkle cream they can marinate in a wrinkle cream. It doesn't matter. Why, what freaks us out about wrinkles is not the wrinkles, but that they are signs of mortality. They are signs that nobody lives forever. Now, religion, of course, in the age of faith, offered some comfort there. And this is in the sense that, well, this isn't the only thing. In fact, if you take some of the religions are like, in fact, this life is pretty much nothing. This life is empty. There is a Buddhist tradition in this poem. The fire sermon is a sermon that Buddha gave, where he essentially said everything burns, suffering is desire on this earth, and we need to learn detachment. We need to meditate and seek an enlightenment where we understand that we're all interconnected, and that the desire is suffering, and suffering is desire. They're the same thing. Desire, you get your desire or you don't. And when you get your desire, it's desire, and when you don't, it feels like suffering. But in both cases, suffering and desire are the result of attachment. So you got something that you really like, and you drop it, and it breaks. So the desire, when you got it, was you were thrilled. You dropped it, it broke. Now you're suffering. It's the same thing. And Buddha wasn't necessarily saying don't ever do anything, don't have anything pretty, don't eat a nice meal. He's just saying try to not to get attached to it, because attachment is suffering. And I don't think it's a tricky point, because you don't want, it's hard to imagine like a marriage proposal where you say, "Oh, my darling, would you spend your life with me," and just not get too attached. So it's a deeper sense. Of course, you're going to feel an attachment to the love of your life, but recognize as well that the love of your life can't live forever either. So you will lose the love of your life, either by leaving this life yourself, or them leaving. So it's not like you don't love them, but understand that all things change, and nothing is permanent. And if you think it is, you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer more than you have to, because to a certain degree, you can't live and not suffer. Suffering is also an inseparable part of living. People you love, pets that you love, they will die. You'll have to face your own mortality. There's no way through this life without suffering, which is one reason we're in such an age of addiction, because addiction tries to offer ways to eliminate suffering. But in eliminating suffering, absolutely, addiction freezes life. I mean, think about a plastic rose. Why wouldn't everyone buy plastic flowers? They don't die and they look pretty good. I've seen them, a lot of them, you glance at them and you can't even tell. Often you'll be like, oh, wow, are these real? And people might say yes and they might say no, but why give, so Valentine's Day is, it's not here for a while, is it? But it's a tough day. But most people want flowers and chocolate and that roses, and they don't want plastic roses. I mean, I can't recommend that you bring to your to your love a plastic rose and say, look what I got. This is so cool. It's a plastic rose. It's Valentine's Day, so I love you, and here's a rose. And when Valentine's Day is over, give it back, and then I'll give it to you again next year. Isn't that great? I mean, look at all the money we're gonna save. And then your lover is like, I think we have to rethink our relationship. It's like, why? Because I'm smart. I just bought you a plastic rose. It's like, yeah, you just bought me a plastic rose, but why? Why is that unromantic? And by the way, it is, just to be clear. Don't say Professor Leonard said everyone should give plastic roses. I did not. You're not paying attention. We give a cut living rose because roses, one of the reasons roses that are real will always be more beautiful than roses that are plastic is that rose that's real is dying. That's the paradox. You have to, the beauty of a real rose is inimitable because you're watching a beauty that will not last. A cut rose it's beautiful in a way that we can't even express because it won't stay beautiful. There's Wallace Stevens is a great poet who was writing around the time of T.S. Eliot, and he said at one point, death is the mother of beauty. And it is. A rose is beautiful because it's dying, because it's not here forever. The people we love are beautiful because they won't be here forever. If they were here forever, I don't know what love would be if nobody ever died. What's the point? You're going to be here forever. Who cares? Come, go, divorce, marry. What does that even mean? What does anything mean? If you guys are going to live forever, why would you care about your midterm? I'm supposed to say your final exam is in December, and they're like, big deal. I'm busy for 10,000 years. I'll get back to you. We wouldn't know how to do anything. We would have neither ire nor suffering. And this comes up a lot in the poem, where people are so anxious to control everything that they insulate themselves from life. And in a way, World War I was the result of denying death. 20 million people died because we denied death. The amount of money that flowed in from the colonies and it allowed the production of numerous commodities that made everything seem like we could all just live forever. I mean, the intended is basically in a mausoleum when Marlowe comes back to tell her and really write on her gravestone, his last words were your name. And she's like, I knew it. Words to live by. I was sure. I mean, he might as well have shut the door of a mausoleum. Now she can float around that room with her eerie piano keys and just think on and on about this love of her life who's not what she thought. And Kurtz made the same mistake in a different way. He believed in rationality and efficiency and civilization and nothing else. In a way, he didn't have faith. And in fact, at one point, it seems that he appeared to try and present himself as a kind of a god to the natives in a desperate attempt to feel faith in them. I mean, if he could get them to believe he was a god, maybe he could get himself to believe it through them. But he failed. So the art of living is a knowing that death is the mother of beauty. It doesn't mean you want to die sooner or anyone else, but you need in order to live and to feel like things have meaning and significance, you need to know that nothing is permanent and everything changes it. And not just know that, but feel it. And in a way, the Archduchess that he talks to, and she says, when we were children staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. So frightened of death, frightened of a sled, frightened of going down a hill. He said, Marie, hold on down in the mountains there. You feel free. So earth and mountains. So you take that, sleigh rides are fun. They're a little dangerous. You don't want to get hurt, die. Skiing, all these things. But where's the thrill? Where's the thrill of getting to the bottom of the hill and maybe tumbling off your sled and shrieking? And then, you see all the kids doing this. They tumble and they shriek and then they laugh and they dust off the snow and they start pulling the sled up to do it again. That's a model of living in a way. That way you don't want to go off a cliff, but you don't want to never go down a hill. But something's happened to Maria, because after that, after saying the mountains are where you feel free, and the winter snow, she simply says, I read at the night and go south in the winter. So she doesn't go to the mountains anymore. She doesn't stay in the refreshing snow, and one thinks of the dead again. So she's depressed, and she says, she earlier in her in the one line that we hear from her, she's essentially said, I'm not really Russian, I'm Lithuanian, a real German. But all the empires collapsed after World War I as well, and she no longer feels like she has any connection, or she's waiting to die, because she's not even waiting to die as in hoping to die, but she's not living. She reads, she goes south, she just stays away. And then we get to, I think, arguably one of the most important lines in the poem. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Because in a way, Eliot is saying, stop walking around moaning that this wasteland isn't a meadow anymore. It's not, and it's not going to become one just because you don't like it being a wasteland. Even if it does rain, there's just dirt. There's nothing to hold the dirt. We learned that during the Great Bowl, during the Depression, where they over-farmed the Midwest and the winds blew away all the topsoil and they couldn't grow crops. And it was, along with the Great Depression, caused starvation and incredible suffering. So Eliot's saying, stop expecting a meadow to grow out of rubble. I mean, you just blew up the world, 20 million dead. You can't just go pretend that didn't happen, because Europe was a wasteland. Everybody's heart was a wasteland. Their souls were wastelands. Nobody was able to grow, and everyone kept saying, "Well, we'll be all right. I mean, something will grow, right?" No. Well, it'll rain, won't it? No. Because sunsets will be beautiful again. No. You're going to have to move out of the depression, back to the grief, realize what you have lost, realize the suffering that you've endured, and make a new commitment to living significantly, and which will involve suffering, but not just suffering. Because the other thing that's been lost in the shadow of the laws of transcendental certitude is the meaning of sacrifice. Sacrifice is giving up something for a greater good. And, these days we would call that, someone who did that, a sucker and a loser. We've heard this, from the Trump era quite a bit, that anybody who would forego profit for the sake of something they feel might be more important than that, well, that's your choice, but you're a loser. Don't come whining to me when you don't have your millions of bucks or whatever it is in the Cayman Islands. I mean, you didn't have to help those people. You could have screwed them over and had money like I do. So why are you even talking to me? Why are you asking me to give up anything that I have? I bumped into someone the other day who said, I don't really like OHIP because I have enough money to go to a doctor. Why am I paying for that homeless guy on the corner to go to a doctor? And I said, well, because you're human. Does that help? It's nice that you have enough money to go to a doctor. Sounds like you have enough money to go to 2 doctors. So why don't you let this guy go to the other one? If you have more than you need, why not share with people who have less? It's just strange how that's become, loser talk. or something. And then take it a step further. Maybe you give away more than you can afford if the cause is great enough. I think people who marched off to war felt like they might be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice and die there, but they had been told that it would be worth it. They had been hypnotized. If we think of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it's like this autocratic Caligari guy had hypnotized them into going out and which is what Caesar does, the guy that Caligari controls. And 2/3 of the way through the movie, you seem to discover that in fact the psychiatrist, who's also a carnival operator, is the one who's actually insane. And so the head of the institution is insane. And then they tag on one last ending where no, he's not. He's fine. It's just Caesar is a paranoid schizophrenic, and he thinks that this very nice psychiatrist is Dr. Caligari, this crazy guy. And the psychiatrist says, now that I know that that's what he thinks, I can cure him. It's a very sinister ending and rather subtle, because it's like the real ending is, no, Caligari is nuts. This head of this institution, the head of these European countries, they sent 20 million people to die, and they have to hypnotize them into thinking that that's all, that they had no choice. That's all there was that they could do. And they're insane. And they were exposed as insane. And then suddenly they rewrote themselves back in as, no, I'm not insane. Actually, you are. But now that I know you think I'm insane, I know how to cure you. Well, that's like telling an abused child, I know you don't like these things we're doing, and I know you want to tell other people. And now that I know that you're upset about that, I can explain to you why you don't want to do it. I mean, it's just doubling down on the abuse. That's the main thing I was wanting you to notice in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, actually. Is the way authority is legitimately presented as an insane force using ideology and propaganda to hypnotize people into going off and killing and being killed. And then when the war exposed them, the masters of war, as Bob Dylan calls them, and I hope you die and your death will come soon. I'll follow your coffin beneath the pale afternoon. They managed to rewrite it and say, well, I'm sorry you have post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sorry you want to protest in the streets, but we can't have that. But now that I know what your problem is, I can solve it. So the insane head of the asylum, once again, marks as lunatics the people who are actually making sense. And you'll see that in the Wasteland. It's often and it's true, Hamlet is a major subtext of this poem. And Hamlet either pretended to be mad after he learned that his father had been murdered by his uncle, or he also was a little mad. And when Polonius gets suspicious that maybe Hamlet's not as insane as he sounds, he famously says, though this be madness, yet there is a method in it. And this has become a cliche now, a method in my madness. There can be a method to madness. And the reason that because it's not mad. It looks mad because it's different. It's not the product of hegemonic discourse. So it looks to be who even thought this up? But hegemonic discourse is insane. Caligari is insane. The heads of the European states, the masters of war, they're the ones who are insane, not the people in the institution. They've just been convinced that they're insane. They've been convinced that they have no choice. I mean, hypnotism in Caligari is a sort of visual equivalent of hegemonic discourse. Caesar doesn't seem to know what to do except what he's told. And when that man comes up to him and says, Caesar has been presented as a prophet, he says, well, when am I going to die? And Caesar says, tomorrow morning. But that's also an allusion to trench warfare, that soldiers were told, tomorrow we're going over the top. You're 30 years old, you're healthy, and tomorrow you're going to die. Because, and of course, remember Wilfred Owen, sorry. his poem, that how sweet it is to die for one's country. And he said, that's an old lie. And you wouldn't have written that rah-rah poem about who's for the game if you'd seen this man who was thrown into the back of a truck, having inhaled mustard gas, whose face looked like a devil sick of sin. So when we said, so what grows in the stony rubble? And the voice continues, Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. There's lots of echoes of the Old Testament and the New Testament in this poem, and there is a point where in the Old Testament, when they're talking about the Judgment Day and the end of the world, how it's going to become a wasteland. And I think the prophet Ezekiel says, the grasshopper shall be a burden. The grasshopper will have nothing to do when you come the end of the world. And you can hear an echo of that in Eliot's line, the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief. Because normally when a cricket chirps and starts hopping around, it's a healthy meadow. But if the grasshopper is a burden, that means there's no meadow, and there's nothing for the grasshopper to do, and there's no relief. There's lots of birds in this poem, but they're often flying away, or they can't sing anymore, or they do sing, but the sound is ugly. So the meadowlark, the nightingale. There's lots of allusions to birds, but they're not. The songbirds aren't singing, and there's many things in this poem that we normally would think would sing, and they either don't sing or they're singing out of tune. And in one case, we'll see a woman who's just had kind of meaningless sex with a guy who obviously couldn't care less about her, and she puts on a record. And records were the gramophone was very new in 1922. So we have popular music, but we don't have songbirds. And the popular music, there's nothing necessarily wrong with popular music. Actually, I like a lot of it. But it's not necessarily the same as walking in a meadow and hearing a songbird. That's a different experience. It takes us back to William Wordsworth's famous line saying, getting and spending we have laid waste to our powers. Little in nature is ours. So you can buy records and you can buy all of these distractions. What in nature is yours? What are the roots that clutch? Or are you trying to grow your roots in stony rubble? So it's not your roots that are the problem, and it's not that you aren't growing that's the problem. It's where you expect to grow. Why would you expect your roots to clutch in an environment that's stony rubble? You can say this about relationships. So of course, it's much easier to see this when you see a couple where somebody's really unhappy, and we'll see a couple like that in this poem, and they just don't make the connection. And you could almost say to your friend, like, what are the roots that clutch in this relationship with this other person? Why do you expect to be happy? This relationship, this person you're with, for you at least, is stony rubble. They don't care, or they want to care, but they don't, or there's some fatal mismatch, and you can't grow a flower out of rock. And yet we cling to things. We cling to them convinced that by clinging they'll be better, because we're afraid to let go. Partly because we don't have a lot of communal support when we're in free fall. No one wants to let go when they don't know how far the drop is. It's hard to blame them. If you have faith, you have some idea of how far up you are. Can you let go and survive the fall? Are you just a foot or two off the ground, or 150 feet off the ground? How do you know? Faith, to some degree, tells you how far you'll drop when you let go. So there's the dry stone, no sound of water, only there is shadow under this red rock. And I've said another very important line. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And in other words, death. I'll show you death. But notice he says, I'll show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. In other words, your ordinary day isn't as important. In fact, your ordinary day won't mean anything if you don't also know. You don't have to think it all the time, but know that you're from dust and will return to dust. So how does that affect the way you live? How does the fact that you're going to die affect the way you live? And the paradox here is that thinking about death, it sounds depressing, but it's not thinking about death. It's depressing. It's expecting life to somehow just go on forever and always present itself to you as meaningful. You have to make it meaningful. I mean, the meaning of life, when you hear people ask the question, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is asking that question. There's no answer. The meaning of life is asking the question, what is the meaning of life? And living in the question. That's what life is. Life is the question. Death is the answer. Why are we in such a hurry? You know, Google death and your name comes up. Not unlike Caligari. So then we get some German translated. Frischricht de Wind der Heimat zu meiner Kind, wo Wallace du. German lines, fresh blows the wind towards home, my Irish child. Where are you now? That's the translation. And this is a sailor's song that's overheard by a princess. Not a Disney princess, a real one, Princess Isolda, who she's on her way to a loveless marriage to a king she has to marry for geopolitical reasons, and she wants to drink poison to kill herself, rather than go to this horrible marriage that she doesn't want. But her maid substitutes a love potion for the poison. So she drinks the love potion and in front of the king's nephew and Tristan, and falls in love with him. And wants to live again. And then we're going to return to that. Tristan and Isolde is yet another. There's 50 subtexts to this. So don't get discouraged if you're like, how the hell am I going to keep track of them all? Nobody keeps track of them all. They come and go. That's the beauty of reading this poem. It's like playing a Beethoven sonata. You know, why do we keep playing Beethoven's sonatas? It's not like we haven't heard it before. It's the process of listening to it and the process of playing it that transports us. It doesn't matter that we know what Beethoven, we know the ninth movement is bum, 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 bum. You know, we know that. Why do we? But we're really moved when we hear it again. And then we come to some quotes. So this is somebody speaking, and we're getting another memory. You gave me hyacinths of kind of flower. First, a year ago, they called me the hyacinth girl. That's the end of the quote. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, notice water, which we're not going to get. There's no water in the wasteland. Your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead. And that's one of the themes of the poem. Don't live your life neither living nor dead. No wonder the zombie is the dominant horror trope of our time. Living dead, stumbling around. People stumbling around still dressed in their work clothes now that they're dead, because they can't think there's no other meaning than the meaningless commute that they did every day. So her arms are full, her hair is wet. In other words, she's beautiful, and it would be a time to say, you're beautiful, I love you. You know, I could not speak. It's too scared, like too much. What if you got rejected? Or it's afraid to make a commitment, afraid to say how they really feel. And my eyes failed. So notice that he can't say, I love you. He can't see at all. And I was neither living nor dead. I was in a coma or some kind of stasis, cryogenic state. And I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light. Silence. Now look, Conrad really liked Heart of Darkness, and look what he's done here. He's basically saying, because of this silence, I was looking into the heart of light, and I became the heart of darkness. The silence, which is pretty much the plot of Heart of Darkness, a book you have read, I hope. So Oed onlia dis mir. This is translated as empty and desolate the sea. And it's an ode to the scene in Tristan and Isolde, which we've already heard about. Tristan is dying, and he wants to see Isolde one more time before he dies, and she's trying to get back to him from across the sea. It's a long story, but at least anyway, in this scene, he's just scanning the horizon of the ocean just would want to see the sail so that he can hang on and they can at least have this final reunion. And it's a little like the Hyacinth girl, where except Tristan and Isolde, they both die. And same with Romeo and Juliet. They both die as a result of their love, but there's a sense of have they the same feeling Gabriel has about Michael Fury and his wife Greta. Have they perhaps lived more than we have or ever will, even though in fact they die young? Because dying young doesn't mean that you didn't live a full life necessarily. And you can die very, very old and not have lived a full life at all. So it's something to try and bear in mind. How much life did you live? It's not strictly speaking, I lived 90 years of life because I'm 90 years old. You could live 90 years of life and die when you're 20. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that you can live, live what you can, live as much as you can. Don't turn away from life out of a mistaken idea that you're staving off death, because nothing staves off death. So love somebody, take a chance. Yes, you can get hurt, but also, so even as you're taking a chance, understand that nothing is permanent. Things change. Doesn't mean you will fall out of love, but it also means that you could, and that's a part of life too. So Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold. Nevertheless, is known to be the oldest woman in Europe with a wicked pack of cards. Now, one of the rhythms of the poem, and this is that you go from almost biblical pronouncements to just common vulgarities. So in this age where faith is so rare, you have horoscopes, which are a kind of poor man's faith, to read the tarot cards. And here, said she, is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look, here is Belladonna, the lady of the rocks, the lady of situations. So she's laying out these tarot cards. When you think about it, a tarot card reading is an attempt to impose sense on those parts of your life that don't make sense. Does he really love me? Do I really love them? Or him? Or her? Will I be happy? So then all these cards are put out there, and only the clairvoyant can read them. And one has to be careful, because the clairvoyant can be a kind of emotional fascist. They can either tell you what you want to hear. I mean, you're paying them, so they can read the cards and say, yes, you'll be happy. Usually they give good readings because people are going to come back to hear what Cesar has to say. When am I going to die? Well, he tells the truth. He says tomorrow. And then hypnotized goes out that and kills him. That's why he dies. That's what Cesar predicts. So Belladonna, Lady of the Rocks, here's a man with 3 staves, and here's a wheel, and here's the one-eyed merchant, and this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. Now look at the way this goes. It's interesting. There's a card that's blank, something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. Now we've talked about this before. There's always something real beyond your reality that you can't see. And the integrity of your reality depends on your not seeing it, which means that reality always has a blind spot in order to be reality. That if you don't have a blind spot, if there isn't something you're forbidden to see, then there's nothing that you can see. What you see is also the result of what, for whatever reason, you don't. You can't see everything all at once. If you're looking for your friend in a crowd, and all you're able to do is look at the crowd, you're not going to be able to find your friend. And when you search the crowd and finally see the familiar face and wave, you can't see the crowd anymore. So you can see the face, you can see the crowd, you can't see them both. And this is the problem with instrumental rationality. It acts like it can see everything. It can only see through a specific prism. And what it doesn't see, it denies. And that's the problem. All of us have selective vision, which is why none of us should be telling anyone else that what I see is what you should see. Because what I see is the result of what I don't see, and what you see is the result of what you don't see. And nobody has a patent on truth in that sense. And so somebody, if you're trying to find your friend's face and someone keeps saying, look at the crowd, look at the crowd, you're going to say, shut up, I'm trying to find my friend. I care about the crowd. Because in that moment, it's not about the crowd for you. It's fine for your friend to have fun looking at this amazing crowd. It's not what you're trying to do. And then she adds, I do not find the hanged man, which is one of many suggestions that modern life refuses to admit death. I cannot find the hanged man. I can't find death in this reading. And if you can't find death in your understanding of life, then there's a danger that you are neither living nor dying. It goes on to say, fear death by water. Well, that's wrong. But the wasteland desperately needs is water. But if you fear death and fear drowning, and drowning is certainly, it's already been alluded to quite a bit, then it won't rain. You have to risk drowning to have rain, or to go on a boat for that matter. I see crowds of people walking around in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. Horoscope readings were not strictly legal at this time. This may also be a reference to the Spanish flu, which seems relevant to point out here during COVID. In other words, if I give this to you to give to somebody else, then because the Spanish flu killed millions right about towards the end of World War I, and it didn't come from Spain. It's just that Spain wasn't in the war, so they were reporting on the deaths, whereas the countries that were fighting were suppressing information about the flu because they didn't want it to affect morale. So we're going through some of this right now, like how much do you shut down? How much do you open up? Who's telling the truth? The Spanish flu got so bad because wouldn't talk about it. Because they were trying to win the war, and the Spanish flu we didn't get it. It was not under control until a couple of years after the war, when they no longer need to act like it wasn't happening. Because they were also worried that if soldiers got word that their relatives were dying, they would desert the battlefield. And this is kind of an ugly Masters of War thing. They would rather the men stayed in their trenches and died than hear that their mother or grandmother was dying and say, screw this. I don't know why I'm shooting at this guy. I don't even know who he is. I'm going to go home and care for, or at least say goodbye to my dying mother. Unreal City, the next one begins. So now we're going to switch to London. We had Marie's memories of Munich before World War I. We had it shifts to London after the war, and we get this description of London. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. So the poet is walking probably against rush hour pedestrian traffic across the London Bridge because people are streaming toward him, and he can tell by their faces that they're devastated, they're wrecked. They're neither living nor dead. They're shells. They go to work, they go home. They go to work, they go home. Nothing. And then he just further describes them. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. No, nobody's looking up. Nobody's looking at anyone else. Nobody's looking at him. He's looking at everybody, and he sees that nobody is looking at anyone. All lost in their own grief, their own depression, no community. All there is routine. It's Eliot who famously says in another poem, I measure out my life with coffee spoons. So they flowed up the hill and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours. That would be a church with a clock, with the dead sound on the final stroke of 9. This was true, as Eliot mentions in the notes, that sometimes these church bells would get out of order, and they would either miss one of their clangs, or the clang would be off, and it was hard to fix these clocks, so sometimes they didn't get fixed. But 9 o'clock would be the beginning of the workday. So at 9 in the morning, the sound of the bell hits this flat note, which is doesn't resonate. So there's a lot in this. Eliot would not have known the term McJob or temp or cubicle, but this is the beginnings of those of kind of bureaucratic jobs. If you've seen the comedy The Office, that the absurdities of putting people in close proximity and having them try and sell paper all day, or something equally disconnected to anything they care about, and to be constantly judged by how many pieces of paper you sell. So then I saw one I knew. So we talk about a face in the crowd, and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Mylae." Now, here's one of the places. Here's where time doesn't hold in this poem, because the Mylae was thousands of years ago. It was in the Punic War. It was a fight over Carthage, a naval battle over Carthage. But Eliot collapses that, because what he's really saying is war is war, and this idea that World War I was called the war to end all wars. That's such a lie. There's no such thing. War is to start war, and continue wars. War is the continuation of war. Wars don't end wars. Even when they end, they've just set up the next one. And that is certainly what happened with World War I leading into World War II. "That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed?" So again, what kind of fertilizer is this? Obviously, planting dead bodies in the ground was a fact of World War I. Has it begun to sprout? The men who are planted in the dirt are not going to spring up like new flowers. They're gone, and they're not regenerating that way. And we're going to have to regenerate some other way. "Oh, keep the dog far hence, that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again." Now, this may be a reference, and this will make more sense in Mrs. Dalloway too, that don't dig up memories. Don't, the what digs up memories is a bad dog who's digging up a garden. But what's needed is bad dogs. We need, a dog will go to what's of significance sometimes that everyone else is walking around. Be like, "Hey, get out of that! Don't come here! Stop it!" Because it's something that we don't want to pay attention to. And then he ends. Part one is ended with "you," and this is one of the moments where Eliot's probably breaking the fourth wall. He's talking to you, the reader of the poem. "You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. You, hypocrite reader, my resemblance, my brother." So it's partly from Baudelaire, an earlier poet, but it's almost like he rounds on you, like, "I see you. You're reading this poem. Are you taking it in? Or are you being a hypocrite? And by the way, I'm just like that, and that's why I wrote this poem, because I'm just like you. So insult, you hypocrite." And then it's like me, my brother. We're all hypocrites. And I'm trying to break out of my hypocrisy, and I'm trying to break through yours, so that this poem will connect, so that a meadow might come out of the wasteland. So stanza 2 is a game of chess, it's called. And chess is really, it's a metaphor for relationships, but relationships that have become purely logistical. There's very little passion. So you move a piece because you're trying to think a couple moves ahead. Everyone, it's antagonistic to a certain extent, and edgy. And then we get this description, which is overlaid with descriptions of Cleopatra from Shakespeare's Cleopatra. It's not the right title, but I'm tired and I want to keep moving. There's so many allusions. I can't pull them all out of my head right away. Mark Antony is, anyway, it's a Shakespeare play. "The chair she sat in, the burnished throne, glowed on the marble, where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table, as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it from satin cases poured in rich profusion." So it's Julius Caesar. I'm trying to think of, but anyway, this is a woman's vanity which is described in incredibly common terms. But these are just things. It's a little like that chapter in Dorian Gray where he buys all these amazing things and none of them make him feel better at all. So we pivot from this description. What's beautiful in this room are just the things. In the woman in the room is depressed and anxious and miserable, and that seems to in the beginnings of learning that shift when we turn to in vials of ivory and colored glass unstoppered lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, not flowers, synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the sense in odors. So there's too much. All these, instead of flowers with the smells, there's this kind of explosion, and really that's what her mind feels like. There's so much going on in her mind that there's no single smell. Everything is troubled, confused, and drowned. So the senses in this poem, in modern life, the senses get overwhelmed all the time. Everybody's shouting for your attention. Everyone's trying to have a cooler video and a better ad and something more exciting. And it can result in everything gets overwhelmed. Video games certainly can operate on this principle as well, to try and overwhelm the senses with surround sound and Oculus Rift or whatever it's called, where you actually stick your head in the game, as far as I can tell. So this goes on, this description, and in the interest of time, I'll move a little bit. But there is, above the antique mantle, this is worth pointing out, was displayed as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, change of Philomel by the barbarous king, so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug jug to dirty ears. Now this is an important allusion. So this is just a painting in this hotel room, but it's of Philomel, who was changed into a nightingale by the gods. So it's a painting of that transformation. Now the reason all this happened is that Philomel was raped by her brother-in-law when they were traveling to see her sister. And after the rape, she shouted, I will tell everybody, I'm going to fill the woods with your crime. So he cut out her tongue. And so she couldn't tell her sister that her husband had raped her. But she did instead, and this is really the way this poem is written, is she wove a tapestry in which she showed the story of her rape. And unbeknownst to the king, she was making this tapestry right in front of him the whole time. There was a mess of madness. He didn't care. She couldn't speak. She wasn't going to tell of the rape. Well, no, she wasn't going to tell. She was weaving the story into the tapestry. And when she gave it to her sister as a present, and her sister looked at it and saw what was depicted and realized that her husband had raped her sister, she killed their 2 children, cooked them, and fed them to the king. And after he'd finished eating his children, and he pushed back from the table and said, "Where are my children?" she said, "They're here," and pointed to the casserole. The Greeks don't play. I mean, that's a serious story. And so then he chases after both his wife and Philomel to kill them. Gods take pity on them, and they turn them both into birds, and Philomel is turned into the nightingale. So it fits the theme of the Wasteland. Rape is and raping a young maiden, raping the innocence of soldiers who march to war as idealistic civilians, patriotic. Violation and rape is everywhere in this poem. And then we finally get a footsteps shuffled on the stair, and apparently a man comes in. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out into fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. And now the wife, it's either the wife or the lover, it's hard to tell. She speaks to the man who comes in the room. "My nerves are bad tonight." "Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me." "Why do you never speak?" "Speak." What are you thinking of? What thinking what? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. This reminds me of Greater Love. I mean, this is a trench. The trenches were called Rat's Alleys in the war, and the dead men are there, and their bones are there. The men are gone. They lost their bones, and they're in the fields somewhere. Well, so what he's saying is, I don't know what you're talking about. She, perhaps understandably, is really frustrated. Like, you never talk, you never tell me what you think, you never say I love you, you never do anything. What are you thinking? Just say something, damn it. And this guy's like, we're in Rat's Alley where the dead men lost their bones. I'm back with my comrades who are dead, and I'm not, and I don't know why, and what are you even talking about? And she continues, what is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? And of course, when you're suffering from trauma, you remember nothing and you remember too much. Or you remember nothing because to remember would be too much. So it's not that you don't have memories, it's that you can't bear them. And then if you're not able to remember, you're not able to speak. And so again, we get, I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. So this is a reference to a drowned man in The Tempest, who decomposed until his eyes looked like pearls. So again, he's thinking of a dead man. Are you alive or not? And frankly, that's a good question. Are you living or dead? Is there nothing in your head? And then we shift to a popular song at the time. But oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. It's a fairly silly pop song. A distraction. It's an earworm, like some Taylor Swift song you can't get out of your head. And it's a way to distract yourself. It's a way to fill your head when you've got nothing that you can access. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down. So, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? And in a way, she's frantic for distraction, and he's just incapable. And she's ready to run out into the street, in bathrobe and hair everywhere and look like a crazy person. And then he kind of recounts in the same dull, dead voice, the hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. So we'll do what we always do, not because we want to, but because it doesn't matter. And we get that same tractionless feeling of routine and habit somehow taking the place of living. Then we switch entirely. Boom, we're out of there. And we're suddenly in a pub somewhere. And someone's speaking in a Cockney accent. And they're relating a story to another person. And the story roughly is about what happened when a soldier came home to his wife. And the wife is named Lil. And the narrator of this story is being very judgmental of Lil because the soldier husband sent money ahead and said, buy yourself something nice. She didn't, and in fact, she bought pills to attempt an abortion, possibly with a child that was not her husband's. So again, we get this violation of trust, violation of marriage, violation of sexual relationship. Fertility, against fertility, she got pregnant and was trying to get rid of it. So it goes something like, husband got demobbed. I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, and while this is going on, the bartender is, as they often do, especially in Britain, when it's time, there's only one time for one more round. Hurry up, please. It's time. Hurry up, please. It's time. That means, if you want to order a drink, you got to order in the next minute or two, or not be able to serve you. And so then she goes back to talking. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did. I was there. You have them all out, Lil, and get a nice set, he said. I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it him, his others will, I said. Oh, is there? She said. Something to that, I said. Well, then I'll know who to thank, she said, and gave me a straight look. In other words, I hate having sex with my husband. You'd be doing me a favor if you have sex with him and get him off of me. So again, lack of love, lack of connection, lack of intimacy, routine. Hurry up, please. It's time. Well, if you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be right, but I've never been the same. Well, you are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home. They had a hot gammon, and they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. It's a kind of an odd name because if she's, basically said to this friend, look, if you don't sleep with Albert, somebody else will. And she's like, who, you? And she's like, yeah, maybe. And she's like, good, you'll be doing me a favor. And then she invites her over to dinner. Setting this up, it's just left open. But the lack of connection and the maneuvering, the chess game quality of it all. Nothing here is done out of genuine surging up of love. It's all strategy. Like, here's some money, get some teeth, or don't get some teeth. If you don't do it, somebody else will. Albert needs a fun time, and so on. Part 3 is called the Fire Sermon, and it alludes to Buddha's sermon, which I've already mentioned, where he says all things burn, and attachment is a source of suffering, and life is suffering, as in addition to being life, and suffering is part of life. And we're still in London. He's down by the Thames, the river that runs through London. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. That line is actually from a beautiful poem by Edmund Spenser in the 17th century to Queen Elizabeth about a beautiful wedding. And so we get that deliberate juxtaposition of a beautiful meadow with a wasteland. It crosses the brown land unheard, the nymphs are departed. And then the beautiful line from Spenser, sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. But this river, it's fall now. It's the river bears no empty bottles, sandpapers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes. Believe it or not, they used to think silk handkerchief, or so men told the women, was as good as what we now would call a condom, that somehow silk protected the woman from pregnancy. So a silk handkerchief. So in other words, people come down by the river to have sex, sometimes with prostitutes, sometimes with girlfriends, places, illicit sex, if you will, because that's conducted in the park because it can't happen at home. So the bears, empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed. Now here, this could be a double reference to prostitutes, because the prostitutes would walk up and down the Thames, soliciting or waiting to be solicited. And their friends, the friends of the prostitutes, the loitering heirs of city directors departed, have left no addresses. So men who come into town on business could head to the Thames, married men obviously, or single, and hire one of the nymphs for a tryst right there in the bushes or off to the side. It was a known place to do that. The waters of Le Mans, I sat down and wept. And this is here. Eliot may be referring to himself, because he actually was at a lake called Le Mans in Switzerland, and Le Mans being the French word for the lake. And he was convalescing from a depressive collapse. They gave him 3 months off from the bank because he had a kind of mental breakdown. And he actually wrote The Wasteland recovering from his mental breakdown. And so in some ways, you are reading the story of a man's nervous breakdown and how he restored himself. So it isn't just Europe and the war. Eliot's mind itself feels like a wasteland. He's wiped out. Nothing's growing. Nothing's happening in his head. His marriage had gone bad. That it was going bad. His wife was having a nervous breakdown, and that's, you can see some of that in the game of chess. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. At my back, in a cold blast, I hear the rattle of the bones and chuckle spread from ear to ear. This might have been a sound of chuckling people in the bushes. But at my back, this is from a poem called To His Coy Mistress that you guys may know. This coyness, lady, were no crime, had we but world enough and time. But at my back, I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near. It's great. It's probably the greatest seduction poem in English, where the man is saying, let's have sex. Yeah, I know you're a virgin. Yeah, I know we're not married. But look, time's wasting here. You're not getting any younger. The earth's the grave's a private place, I hear, but none but worms for one so dear, and things like that. So talking you into it. And a lot of this went on, frankly, before with the enlisted man, which is a pretty powerful come-on line, especially to a girlfriend saying, "I'm going to war. I got a very real sense of being killed. Would you spend the night with me?" That's not an easy thing to turn down. Maybe, I mean, if the guy's like a stranger, but if you've been dating for a while and they're like, "I would love to have sex with you before I die," that's a pretty good line, and it's a lot better than do you come here often, or what's your sign, or what are you majoring in? I mean, that's some next level stuff. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank, while I was fishing in the dull canal on a winter evening round behind the gas house, musing upon the king my brother's wreck, and on the king my father's death before him. So the Fisher King, and Eliot talks about this in his notes, was a fertility myth, that the reason that the land was a wasteland, this goes back to like the 15th century, is that the king of the land had some mysterious wound, probably depression, or at least in the context of this poem, and it wouldn't heal, and all he did all day was sit and fish, and he let his kingdom go to hell behind him, and so everything was a mess, and someone has to get to the king and cure him. You see a version of it in Lord of the Rings, but this myth of the kind of depressed king and the need to restore the king to some kind of rejuvenation, or else the land will. And you even see it in Lion King, really, where Scar is a terrible fascist replacement for Mustafa, and then the land goes to hell, it becomes a wasteland. Rather unfairly blamed on the hyenas, but that's a whole other story. There's kind of an implicit racism, frankly, that the hyenas also speak like African Americans, and it's the implication that if you let them take over the land, it'll become a wasteland. You're hearing this in campaign speeches right now. I'm keeping them out of your neighborhoods. And so anyway, a distraction, but worth thinking about. Sorry if I ruined the King. And just one last bit from Coy Mistress, because it brings up the idea of a wasteland. For lady, you deserve this state, meaning you deserve marriage, and nor would I love at lower rate, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. And we're going to be dead for a long time. Right now we could make love. It's just, don't say you didn't learn anything from this literature class. The sound of horns and motors, which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in the spring. The moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter. They washed their feet in soda water. Again, there's a rapid vulgarity that's brought on. This was a song the soldiers would sing. Mrs. Porter was typically they did endless verses, and they made up more of them. And Mrs. Porter was the head of a brothel, and so sometimes it would sing about her daughter and the men washing their feet in soda water. But that's also a parody of a scene in the New Testament where Christ gets down on his hands and knees and cleans the feet of all of his disciples to show them that, yeah, he's the Son of God, but he's capable of humility. He's capable of washing their feet, even though he's a God. And that one of the messages of the New Testament was that unlike the Old Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, which is yet another subtext to this poem, that's where Christ famously said, if a man strikes you on the left cheek, offer him the cheek. And that and Christ was specifically pushing back against the Old Testament dictum, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If someone takes your eye, you take theirs. So this was a massive shift in some newer concept, something that people like Martin Luther King and others will bring up, that non-violent civil disobedience. So let me push ahead a little bit, because I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to get to another couple of things. Tiresias, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, also is a prophet who's blind, and he seems to, as when I go to the line, at the violet hour, the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from the sea, which is, in other words, quitting time, violet hour, 5 o'clock. The typist home at tea time clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lifts out food in tins. Out of the window perilously spread, her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, have perceived the scene and foretold the rest. Now Tiresias had been a man and a woman, because one day when he was walking along, he saw 2 snakes mating, and he struck them with his stick, and that made Hera mad. She was the wife of Zeus, so she turned him into a woman so that he could feel what it's like to be the opposite sex and not be so sex phobic. So he had to live as a woman for 7 years, and then he got changed back to a man. And then one day Zeus and his wife were arguing, and Zeus said, "By the way, we get more pleasure out of sex than men do." And she said, "No, they don't." And he said, "Yes, they do." And they had a big fight. And they said, "Well, let's go ask Tiresias. You know you're in trouble when 2 gods have a fight and they want you to settle it. You're screwed either way." So Tiresias said women have get more pleasure, and Hera was mad, so she struck him blind. And gods can't undo what other gods do. Zeus felt pretty bad, and so he gave him prophecy. He gave him the ability to see the future, because he's now, in fact, blind. But nobody ever believed him, as that's so often the case with prophets. And now somehow he got trapped in London, and he's watching, and nobody seems to see him. And he knows what's going to happen. There's going to be some meaningless sex. And I mean, on the one hand, he seems like a peeping Tom hiding in the closet watching 2 people have sex, but he doesn't want to. And he's like, God, I've seen this so many times, and it's the same old thing, and it doesn't matter, and nobody's happy, and I can't even tell them, like, what grows in this stony rubble? What is this 4 o'clock quickie from this guy who doesn't care about you, and you're letting it happen because it seems better maybe than not having a boyfriend at all? But is this guy really a boyfriend? And listen to this description. A small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended. She is bored and tired. Endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved, if undesired. So obviously she doesn't want them, but she doesn't stop them. And I love this line. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. So it's borderline rape or borderline date rape. I mean, she's not saying no, and she's not stopping him. But this next line sort of says it all. And make his vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And even Gabriel wasn't doing that when he grabs Greta and she's just tired. He stops. This guy doesn't care. I mean, she's just not doing anything, and he just satisfies himself, gets up and leaves. Just since he didn't know that she's in front of him. And I, Tiresias, have suffered all, and acted on this same divan or bed. I who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. And now this guy bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. So she's a typist. She doesn't much. Her bed is also her couch. She's got no light that works in her hall. She just had sex with this guy because, well, I don't know, maybe something will happen. If she doesn't have sex with, he won't come back. It all feels a little hopeless. He'll keep coming as long as it's a booty call and she doesn't actually ask for anything. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover, Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done. I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. So she goes into kind of an automatic stance, like, and in the line when lovely woman stoops to folly is actually from a poem that talks about how devastating it is to lose your virginity to someone who dumps you, basically, as a woman. How do you recover from that? And in the poem, it's like you don't. You're so ashamed that you're likely to throw yourself in the river and drown. Well, modern, the sex in the modern age has becomes a matter of such indifference, but that's also a real loss. I mean, you don't want a woman to jump in the river because some guy took advantage of her, but you would like it if things still mattered at all. Like maybe not, maybe notice this guy's not worth it. Value yourself, uh, even when others don't. And we're kind of at that price of nothing, price of everything, and the value of nothing. It's the woman doesn't seem to appreciate one way or the other whether her agreeing to sex is of value. He doesn't seem to have any thought about it either. Sexuality is not a marker of value. It's like gymnastics. It just gets done. And I'm not being rude about this. I'm just saying that intimacy, and it's not only is it possible to have sex without intimacy, but there's nothing less intimate than sex without it, because you've got this physically, you're about as close as you could get, but if there's no intimacy even then it's a very lonely, sterile wasteland effect. So this isn't me saying don't have premarital sex or everything. It's saying that what are the roots that clutch? What grows in the stony rubble? I mean, if it's okay, if there's consent, great, but does it matter? Does it matter to you? Does it matter to them? Does it matter to you whether or not it matters to them? So I'm going to push ahead a little bit to the to part 5, what the thunder said, because this is where the poem shifts and it begins to talk about the Upanishads. Now, we'd already brought in Buddha, it's certainly brought in Christ. So this poem is interested in religion across the board, not just Christian, Buddhist. There's Hindu in here, and a bit of Islam, although a little more obscured. But what the thunder said is, a lot of religions have thunder speak. It's usually a way of talking about what would it sound like if God spoke. Well, it would sound like thunder. I mean, it would be thunderous, and maybe not so easy to understand. So what is the thunder saying? What is God saying? After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the garden, and after the agony of stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with little patience. Now, the first part of this is a description of Gethsemane. That's the place where Christ spent his last night praying all night long before his crucifixion. He knew that he was to be crucified and killed the next day. And the Roman guards came for him with torchlights, red on sweaty faces, and found him in the Garden of Gethsemane, which was a very stony garden by all accounts. And then we fast forward, now Christ is dead. He who was living is now dead. And we who were living are now dying. So that the death of another death of a god, leaving a spiritual wasteland in its wake. Here is no water, but only rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were only water amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carious teeth that cannot even spit. Here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There's not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. And there was not even solitude in the mountains, but red sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were a rock and also water and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, with the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings the songbird in the pine trees, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? And we're back to this. What is there beyond your reality? What is there beyond rational instrumentality? I almost said irrational instrumentality. Who is that on the other side of you? Look around for that shadowy figure that your reality doesn't take account of. That's an important person or faith that's walking beside you all the time. It's often a shadow in this poem. And then finally, the thunder speaks. And in the Upanishads, the thunder speaks. And it says da 3 times. It goes da to the humans. And then it says da to the demons. And then it says da to the lesser gods. And so each time it makes the same sound, but those 3 hear 3 different things. So, and each time the thunder speaks, it says da, and then it says, what have you heard? And then they say what they've heard. And he says, you've understood. And then he says da to the next group. They hear it a different way. It says, you have understood. And he says da to the third group. And they understand yet something else. And he says, you have understood. So there's an idea here that there is no absolute faith for everybody. That part of faith has to be part of what you are. It's not just, you're not just told. You can't really tell people to have faith in me because I order it. Any more than you can say love me, I order it. I mean, you can make people do things, but you can't make them love you or have faith in you, even if you can make them serve your will. So the first thing he says, da, the first group here is, what have we given? And of course, this is God. This kind of gets back to what grows in the stony rubbish. So not what do you have, not what do you want to get, what do you give? Life, is about giving. And being death phobic, people are afraid to give anything away, to give any money away, to give any time away. But what the question is to ask yourself is not how much do I have, but what have I given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which in age of prudence can never track. By this and this only we have existed. In other words, it's those moments where you give up everything without being sure you'll get anything back. Sacrifice, not investment. Investment is phony sacrifice. You give money, but you want twice of it back. Although Christ says, cast your bread upon the waters and it will come back 100-fold. So take your loaf of bread, throw it out in the water, and 100 loaves will come to the beach. It's not for me, but it's a metaphor. So obviously you throw your loaf of bread out in the water, it's gone. You don't have any loaf. But what Christ is saying is take a chance. Don't keep your stingy little loaf of bread all to yourself all the time. Throw it out. Throw it away. Something greater will come back. Nothing great will come back if you don't throw anything out. You sacrifice is what brings meaning. Because you define who you are by how much you're willing to sacrifice and for whom and for why. I mean, how many hours do you spend getting a good grade? There's nothing wrong with that, but you sacrifice. Do you know why? So sacrifice, and by definition, you cannot be sure when you sacrifice that it will be worth it. Because by definition, if you expect something, then you haven't given anything. You've only given something with the expectation of a return. The only way to fully give something is to not expect a return, like really not expect a return. Don't say you don't, but just do it, knowing and saying that I'm not doing this for a return. You'll get back only in that way. Can you get back more than you gave? So an act of compassion, would you do because it's just the right thing to do, like helping the homeless man pay his medical bill because you can, then you've done something good. It's not clear what that homeless man will do for you, maybe nothing, but you're living in a better world. You're living in a world where somebody who is suffering can get some medical attention. It's hard. You can't. You can't be like the accountant and write it down and say, if this homeless guy gets to see a doctor for free, what's in it for me? What's it for me? Well, more than you think, but nothing if you demand an answer to that question. So then it says da. The thunder says da again. Just to finish this. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries. So how you lived won't be in your obituary. I mean, that'll say where you worked. It'll say who survived you. It'll say people loved you. Who cares? I mean, it's the obituary is not your life. And don't live for a good obituary. That's dead. You want to be. You want to live on in the ones you've loved because you loved them. There's no way you can put that in obituary. And we won't find how we've existed in memories draped by a beneficent spider, nor will we find them under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. In other words, when the will is read, so-and-so gets the house, somebody gets a car, so what? It's just stuff. And then he has a great thought here, and he says, I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key. Each confirms prison. Now this is really important. I think this is the best lesson of this whole poem. There is no prison. There is only prison because you're dreaming of a key to unlock you from something that you're not locked into. Thinking of the key creates the jail. And sometimes we would rather think about an impossible release than to live the life we actually have. If I just had a Mercedes, if I just had a 4.0, if I just had a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a job, blah, 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 blah. And then that's your cell, because you don't have that. So then you think of the key, the car, the girl, the boy, whatever, and you've locked yourself up when there's no jail there. So don't dream of a key, because if you dream of a key, you build a jail. So live the life that is there, not the one you wish there, because first of all, it's not there, and the life you need is the one you're living, but you have to know that. In another poem, Eliot says, the end of all our journeys will be to return to from where we began and know it for the first time. So you have to go on the journey, but the journey is not to somewhere else. The journey is back to where you began. And the point of the journey is not someplace other than where you began. It's returning from where you began and now knowing it, knowing what it is, knowing what matters, knowing what is valued. You have to leave what you value to realize, hopefully, that you miss it. And if you don't, you can wander off into a life of suffering and regret because you never back to the thing you had in the beginning but didn't understand it was all you need. What you need, you already have, and yet you're going to have to journey away from it in order to come back and actually know it. And finally, the last da. Then the boat responded gaily, the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. So something finally moves, and it's a boat, and it's on water. And then we get one kind of last line from the king. I sat upon the shore, fishing, with the airplanes behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? So the king's gotten word that he's going to die. And part of the reason he was depressed is that he was depressed at the idea that someday he was going to die. And he was so depressed by the idea that someday he was going to die that he was not living. And because he was the king, the land around him was dying. So part of what he's doing here is accepting his mortality. Like, I am going to die. And then the land can start to act again. Because the king is dead, long live the king. It's him trying to hang on to a life as though he weren't going to die that was killing all the land behind him. And then he goes on to say, these fragments I have shored against my ruins. And that's how he sets his land in order, with fragments. And that's what this poem has been. This poem is fragments shored up against the ruins of a devastated Europe in the wake of World War I, and a devastated man, Eliot, in the wake of a failed marriage and a mounting depression. And then we end with, why then I'll fit you Hieronymus mad again. So we go back, yet another mad prince. But remember how I began this lecture, much madness is divinest sense. And finally we get data, dayadvam, damayata, the three different things that were heard when the thunder said da. And then the poem ends with the last word of the Upanishads, Shanti. And Eliot repeats it 3 times. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And the poem ends. Now, hard to translate Shanti, but it's one of the translations is the peace that passes all understanding. It's that thing I've been talking about this whole lecture, that thing you can't articulate, that thing beyond your reality that you have to believe, and you're not going to have proof of it. You're going to have to believe in loving someone else. You're going to have to believe in sacrificing when no one's making you do it. You have to take a leap of faith. I mean, there's a reason we call that a leap, because there's no tidy little bridge there. You really do have to leap, or it's not faith. It's not faith to take an elevator. That's not a leap of faith. You leap and you sacrifice and you risk love and rejection without certainty that you won't. As Samuel Beckett, someone we read 11 says, try again, fail again, fail better. So it's not try again and you'll succeed. You're always gonna fail. So fail better. Like, accept that failure is an inextricable part of trying. But there are degrees of failing. There's complete failure, to have someone walk toward you and you feel love and you don't say anything. That's a big fail. Or you can say it, maybe not say it perfectly. That's failing better. All right. So I'm tired. Hopefully this poem makes some kind of sense. Sometimes I would suggest it now. You might be ready to read the poem. I've been reading the poem for 30 years, and I still don't think I've read the poem. If you read a poem and you understand it, then you haven't read it very carefully. You got to read a poem until you don't understand it, and then you'll stuck at the point. All right. That's all I got for tonight. I will open the class on a Wednesday, and I'm hoping that I have, if not the grades up, at least ready to go, or something like that. So we are very close, and I appreciate your patience. And have a good rest of your Sunday evening.